Good afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and welcome back to ISTJ Info Dumping, the show where we... Good afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and welcome to another episode of ISTJ Info Dumping, the show where we not only talk about ISTJ functions, but we also talk about ISTJ shadow functions, because I'm pretty sure most Myers-Briggs websites that you guys have heard of do not tell you this piece of crucial information that is going to completely bamboozle you if you're a newbie to studying Myers-Briggs functions, and that's dun 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 dun. You cannot have your first four functions without the shadow functions. In other words, neither can exist without the other. That kind of sounds like that prophecy in Harry Potter when I word it like that. So I've actually done similar talks about this in the past with how you can't have one judging function without the other, and same for the perceiving functions. If you had only intuition and no sensing, you wouldn't be able to categorize sensory details that helped you come to your intuitive conclusions. And if you only had sensing, you wouldn't be able to piece everything together. Every single thing would be its own separate entity, and you wouldn't be able to say, this chair goes with that table. You wouldn't be able to make the connection that the two of them are connected. In the same way with thinking and feeling, if you had all thinking and no feeling, you wouldn't be able to have that I feel like this is the right thing to do. Like, you would just do something logical without having a conviction, which means you probably wouldn't do it at all. And vice versa. If you only had feeling, you wouldn't be able to make a logical conclusion with why you're acting on your feelings, if that makes any sense. But now we're going to get deeper. We're going to get into the category that most Myers-Briggs channels don't even like to think about because they're so underdeveloped. In the case of, I would estimate, about 90% of all of you. We're going to get into why not only does every type have all 8 functions and therefore does in fact use the other 4 functions not in their stack, but if they didn't have the shadow functions, they would not really be able to exist at all. So to make things a bit simpler for those of you who are probably thinking, say what? I don't even know what my shadow functions are. We're going to do it based on the ISTJ. And because we're going to talk through all 8 functions, you can just look at your own function stack and say, oh, okay, I see what you're getting at there, and sort of make up your own conclusions from there. So we'll start with introverted sensing. So obviously the inverse of introverted sensing is extroverted sensing. And a quick and easy way to tell which functions are your shadow functions and which ones are your main 4 functions is that the shadow functions are basically in the same order as your first 4, but the introversion extroversion is swapped. So if you have introverted sensing first, you're going to have extroverted sensing fifth. So they're always 4 positions apart. So in the case of the ISTJ, our first function is introverted sensing. Why is everything backwards today? The function that governs the fact that we have an amazing memory, but not only do we remember a lot of stuff, but it also leads to us making decisions every single day about something related to past comfortability and past convenience. And it allows us to store our memories and sort of piece together what all of them mean. However, in order for us to have sensory information in the first place, we have to be able to take in the sensory information. Obviously, when an ISTJ is a newborn, they can't go off of what's familiar because they don't have any prior experience to begin with. So, what function is it that governs awareness of reality and acting on that? Well, that would be none other than extroverted sensing, which is the function that takes in sensory input and is constantly wanting new experiences that they can taste, that they can touch. So in the case of the ISTJ, obviously they have an amazing memory and they like to take in all of this fact and information. But to do that, they need their extroverted sensing to take it in. So if I'm reading a document and I'm looking up all these really cool facts and rules, I'm seeing it with my eyes. And my introverted sensing is recalling it and compartmentalizing it. So in that respect, if hypothetically we didn't have extroverted sensing, then that would mean we would never take in new information and we'd be stuck with the same knowledge we had as newborns, which would mean absolutely nothing. Now, moving on to extroverted thinking. This one's a little bit harder to talk about just because I feel like thinking functions in general are just so logical that feeling types would have a hard time telling the difference. In fact, I know of an INFJ friend of mine who keeps insisting that she has extroverted thinking, and actually it was because of that statement she made that made me do this video in the first place. So I don't know how to portray this in a very concise manner, so I hope you'll forgive me if this comes across a lot more awkwardly than the other functions, but an ISTJ's extroverted thinking basically allows them to create a system of doing stuff based on their memories that allows them to establish a logical, pragmatic decision. So, for example, they might be extremely bent on continuing to go along the same path to the park, or they might be insanely aware of how much gas mileage it'll take to get from one location to the other. And so they're very good at managing stuff that's tangible and realistic. And it leads to them not really being that opinionated. I mean, they can be. When we get to introverted feeling, we'll definitely get to that. But they tend to not put as much priority on their personal opinions as they do based on pre-established facts from an external source, be it scientists, be it the church, be it a combination of both. However, the question I get a lot is, are ISTJs just blind robots that'll automatically do what authority says and they'll just support tradition for its own sake? And the answer is, of course not. And that's where the introverted thinking comes in, because introverted thinking is all about creating a framework of understanding to know, like, okay, this is what I personally believe, and this is how I see the world. Now, an ISTJ, obviously, because they don't use introverted thinking, it means they don't really come to their own conclusions a whole lot. But they usually need to come to the conclusions that they're making decisions based on external sources. So, for example, when an ISTJ is in their ruts and their routines, the introverted thinking part of them is what got them the conviction to be in the rut in the first place. As far as why is an ISTJ being so paranoid about survival, the introverted thinking part of them is saying, this is important to me to survive, as opposed to saying, whatever, I'm just going to live life as I want, which that itself is an introverted thinking mindset, because you're coming to that conclusion that whatevering is an introverted thinking process. So if ISTJs didn't have introverted thinking, then they would just blindly accept authority. They'd never question it. They'd never come to their own conclusions. They'd essentially be like the genie in the lamp in Aladdin, where Aladdin makes a wish, and even if the genie doesn't understand it or doesn't personally believe that Aladdin is being ethical, he's kind of just like, okay, your wish is my command, boom. But the fact that ISTJs can say, no, I don't like that. No, I question this. No, I don't like this conclusion. They're subconsciously using introverted thinking to create that framework of understanding. Now we move on to the really messy one, which is introverted feeling. This function, because it's in the tertiary function, it can take a bit of time for an ISTJ to really appreciate it and develop it. Usually it takes them until about their teenage years or early to mid-20s, but once an ISTJ does develop their introverted feeling, it leads to them having an acute awareness of what do they personally believe, like where do their morals stand, and like what are they feeling on the inside that they're not necessarily showing to the world. Maybe they have a neutral expression, but on the inside they're raging and storming in their brain, but say, my raging and storming is irrelevant because that's not going to get anything done. Which leads to the assumption that because ISTJs not only don't have extroverted feeling, but their extroverted feeling is their seventh function, which is the least used, that ISTJs are incapable of empathy, and they're not capable of understanding other people's emotions. But from an ISTJ's perspective, I wouldn't say that we're incapable of understanding, but rather it doesn't intuitively come naturally to us to understand what another person is feeling unless the person makes it very clear what their feelings are ahead of time and tells the ISTJ as though it's an executive order. So in other words, appealing to the extroverted thinking part of them, saying, Paul, this is definitively something that bothers me, and it would be the most pragmatic and logical choice if you respect it. That's generally how you get around an ISTJ not having extroverted feeling. However, if an ISTJ had no extroverted feeling whatsoever, their introverted feeling wouldn't properly be able to function. So it's really hard to think of examples off the top of my head, but the first one I can think of is an ISTJ a lot of times has a remarkable ability to be able to say no without a second thought. You've got the extroverted feelers where it's really hard for them to let people down and say, like, I know you really want this, so I'll just sacrifice my own feelings for your sake. But you see how extroverted feelers do have their own feelings. They just tend to downplay it in favor of group dynamics. In the same way, an ISTJ could hypothetically understand the group dynamics, but think it's stupid. Like they'll say, okay, why are all of you deciding to wear... An example I can think of off the top of my head is here in America, about 99% of American females, once they've hit puberty, they like to shave their legs in the summertime when they're going out in public. Sure, they might choose to not shave them in the wintertime to be warmer, which is actually a very admirable and practical decision on their part. But it's not really an explicit rule. Like, there's no logical reason for them to be doing that, unless they're on a swimming team, in which case they would have less friction. But a lot of the girls I know aren't on swimming teams and they still shave their legs. So obviously the ISTJ is going to be aware that this is a big problem for them. They're going to say, okay, they're clearly bothered by all of this leg hair, but it doesn't make sense to me why they're bothered, why they can't just say, stick it to you, I'm going to do what I want with my own legs. So in that case, the ISTJ is analyzing that there is a group mindset and that these girls are following a pre-established harmonious pattern to avoid causing conflict. They just don't like it. So in that respect, there's that primitive extroverted feeling that is saying, why are you guys being stupid? And I admit I fell into that camp where I was very adamant about, like, why are you guys blindly accepting a tradition that has no basis in actual logic? Now I've gotten to the point where it's just like, if that's what makes them comfortable, whatever. I may not understand it, but I also have my own comfort blankets, like my own hair, that I like to do. It just so happens that 99% of girls share the same comfort blanket. So I've gotten to the point where it's just like, who cares? If it turns out that they're in sin, I'll let God be the judge, and I just will step back and make my life easier by not worrying about everyone else. So there you have the extroverted feeling saying that it wants to take a break from all of the questioning why society seems to have a pack mindset. Now we get into the final function of the ISTJ function stack, which is extroverted intuition. Now, those of you that have seen how I interact with my sister and my parents might have mistaken me for an ENFP, because I'd like to think my extroverted intuition is developed enough by inferior function standards. I do have a really wild, wacky, out-of-nowhere sense of humor. And I do often have a tendency to reject just following along with the crowd and wanting to do my own thing. Like, even if I make a video on my channel that's based on something another YouTuber has already done, like say a ranking video, I'll want to give it a polished twist. So in that respect, I am open to new ideas. That being said, it usually has to be at my own timing. So a lot of ISTJs reject change and innovation, and they like things to stay the same way as they've always been. ISTJs, they like their routine. They like doing the same thing every day. It doesn't bore them like it would the ENTPs and ENFPs of the world. To them, they find comfort in the familiar. And extroverted intuition is more or less an intruder on that comfort. It would be like if you're just minding your own business, sunbathing, and then someone just dumped a bunch of icy water on you. You'd be like, oh, why? I was perfectly comfortable the way I was. And they say, because you need to change. They're like, yeah, but now I'm wet and cold, and I didn't want that. In the same way, that's how ISTJs see change. It comes across as very abrupt and ruining their routine, and they're perfectly happy the way that they are. And other types just want to change for its own sake, and they don't see the point in that. However, and this is going to be really hard for me to verbalize because intuition is my fourth function, but an ISTJ cannot have extroverted intuition if they also don't have introverted intuition, which, if I'm understanding my eighth bottom function correctly, introverted intuition is kind of described as like a tree root, where it likes to go deeper and deeper into a concept, and even though their points may not seem connected at first, it does eventually come back to the same source, but just uses different things that are related to the source to get to the point. This is confusing me even just using my own analogy, so I suppose the simplest way of wording it is that when an ISTJ goes on a wild tangent or has their weird, goofy sense of humor, they're still making connections to make sure that it doesn't just come out of nowhere, that it's still somewhat related. They might be relating it to say, oh, I made this joke because it reminds me of something in Aladdin. Aladdin reminds me of The Lion King because they're both Disney. So there's still that element of connectivity. And as far as going deeper, as opposed to going outward, like extroverted intuition does, ISTJs are definitely capable of thinking deep. They'll say, okay, well, not only do I have my comfort blanket, but I'm going to explain to you why I have the comfort blanket. And here are all the separate reasons coming from one conclusion. So without that, an ISTJ's extroverted intuition would probably just be, change is bad, that's the end of the story, as opposed to saying, change is bad because, and they wouldn't be able to verbalize why they're saying that change is bad. So I hope I gave you guys a little bit of information on how, if you think, Paul, I'm an INTP, but I feel like I use extroverted thinking, it's because you do. It's because it helps you to use your actual functions. The problem is that each of the shadow functions are used so primitively that by themselves, it doesn't really seem like they're using them at all. But deep down inside, they're actually more of like the backstage assistant to the main cast. So that's all the time I would like to delegate to you guys today. If there's anything I missed out, or if you need me to be clearer, please let me know in the comment section. I really appreciate every comment you guys give, as long as it's civil and not like a huge, writhing, spit-filled mess. And until the next time, keep the faith, stay epic, God bless, and even with all this function talk, just be you. At the end of the day, Myers-Briggs is a preference tool, not a doctor's diagnosis. Bye!